Boa noite. O mais importante prêmio literário inglês foi dado para um autor estreante. E essa decisão acabou provocando uma repercussão enorme na imprensa europeia. Não tanto pelo ineditismo da decisão, mas pelas bombásticas declarações do escritor ao tradicional jornal The Guardian. Depois de receber uma bolada de quase R$250 mil, Peter Finlay, autor de VERNON GOD LITTLE, novela passada numa cidadezinha do Texas, disse que pretendia gastar o dinheiro pagando algumas dívidas que contraíra quando era um jogador e um drogado militante. Finlay, que assina sob o pseudônimo de DBC Pierre, Dirty But Clean, ou seja, sujo porém limpo Pierre, traça um ácido panorama da vida no interior dos Estados Unidos e dos adolescentes sem rumo, capazes de um massacre como acontecido em Columbine. DBC Pierre, destaque da ficção contemporânea e ganhador do Book Prize 2003, está no centro do Roda Viva esta noite. Para entrevistar o escritor DBC Pierre, convidamos Jaime Spitzkowski, diretor do site Prima Página e editor-chefe do Jornal do Terra, Silvia Colombo, editora do Folhetim, da Folha de São Paulo, Cassiano Elec Machado, redator-chefe da revista Trip, Gioconda Bordon, do programa Estação Cultura, da Rádio Cultura FM, Luciano Ribeiro, editor-chefe da Vogue RG, Maria Elisa Sevasco, professora de literatura da USP, e o escritor Júlio Ludemir. Também temos a participação do cartunista Paulo Caruso, registrando em seus desenhos os momentos e os flagrantes do programa. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional para todos os estados brasileiros e também para Brasília. E como o programa de hoje está sendo gravado, não permite a participação dos telespectadores. Boa noite, Peter.
Boa noite.
Eu queria começar pelo óbvio. Você, quando deu a entrevista para o jornal Inglês, imaginava a repercussão que ela fosse dar?
Not really, but you have to understand the thing happened very quickly. This was a sequence of events that happened literally in the space of a week. And so my brain was far behind the situation, and I was just acting on instinct entirely. So I didn't certainly expect the amount of attention that there has been.
Eu queria que você contasse um pouco da sua vida. Você nasceu na Austrália e ficou lá até que tempo? Que é a idade? Quantos anos?
Yeah, I was Australian born to one Australian parent, who was my father, and I have a British parent, who's my mother. And I was taken from Australia when I was about 18 months old, and we lived in the United States, where my father was a lecturer at Washington State University. Then I lived in England for a short time, and when I was about 7 years old, we migrated to Mexico City, and I grew up in Mexico City for pretty much the rest of my youth until my early 20s. And since then I've been living in London, Spain and Denmark, Trinidad, and if things go well, I'll come and live here for a little while.
Mas você se imagina como um cidadão, quer dizer, no México você vivia entre a juventude inglesa ou os mexicanos mesmo?
It was a mixture. I went to an international school there, and so my colleagues at school were largely Americans, and there were plenty of English speakers, but there were children from 60 or 70 nations, so it was like a small United Nations, which was very interesting. So every time, for instance, Israel and Palestine would have an argument, both groups of children would be expelled from the school because they would start to fight. It was like a microcosm of the world in a way. But as I grew up, I started more to run with Mexican children, and I found life on the streets much more interesting than the affluent life that we had where I lived.
Peter, numa de suas entrevistas, você declarou que uma das críticas preferidas suas em relação a você veio da Índia, onde o crítico teria dito o seguinte: Pierre era um obscuro canalha vivendo numa área remota da Irlanda. Agora ele é um célebre canalha. Que tipo de canalha é Peter Finlay?
A fading rascal. Between shifting circumstances and age and everything like that, I'm now, at least I'm trying to be a completely conceptual rascal and confine my bad deeds to the pages of a book. But I have been, if you want a serious and honest answer to the question, I probably grew up quite a little narcissist. And I mean that in the sense not of somebody who was obsessed with himself in the mirror, but in that I had very wild and unrealistic dreams, and I used to base a lot of my schemes around these dreams, and this was what started getting me into trouble. So it was, you know, it was mischief of romance, and I was living also in Mexico in a very romantic culture, and there was a feeling that I could do anything, and this is what led me first into trouble. And then once I was in trouble, I lacked the tools and the discipline to ask for help early enough, which would have solved a lot of my troubles, and B, to do the right thing in respect of everyone else's rights and privilege. So it was easy for me to borrow and eventually to steal and to beg from people, thinking that I would create something incredible.
Você usava no seu livro DBC Pierre, Dirty But Clean.
Yeah.
Eu fico curioso no seu próximo livro, se você vai manter esse o DBC, Dirty But Clean, sujo mais limpo, ou se agora vai ser JC, Just Clean Pierre.
Yeah, it's probably not clean yet. There's a great British author called Dan Rhodes, and he has amended my name to Dirty But Comparatively Clean. So that's it.
DBCC.
Yeah, I might change it altogether.
Pierre,
Yes.
Eu queria te perguntar, como professora de literatura, o que é que te fez contar uma história tão contemporânea quanto a do Vernon God Little, que é um garoto absolutamente contemporâneo, cuja vida acaba sendo monitorada pela internet? O que te fez decidir escrever isso em forma de livro? Por que você não filmou a história dele? Por que você não fez um cartoon? Por que você resolveu contar como literatura? Né? O que fez você se tornar um escritor no século XXI, que não é mais o século da literatura?
It's a big question, and I think the heart of the answer is this, that I found myself incredulous, and I still am actually. I'm not so much dismayed at the events of the world, which I find crazy and improbable and brutal often, but I'm amazed that nobody around me seems to be paying much attention to it. And I could, in a certain way, part of the answer anyway is that I was sitting there looking at endless historical romances and science fiction stories and all these different, and I'm sure wonderful literary books. Nobody seemed to be telling this extraordinary and brutal story that was actually happening on the television every night. And so that motivated me to begin. And once I began, then I was plagued with a sense that surely to God, 800 million other authors must have gone, oh, this is the only story today. And they all must be writing the same book. So I had the pressure in my back to finish it before anybody else did it. Because I just couldn't see another story in front of my face. And I knew I needed, first of all, words were cheap to write with because I was poor and I couldn't afford paint. And, you know, that pretty much propelled the thing from start to finish.
Mas o livro ele tem muito fortemente a presença dos diálogos, inclusive na tradução brasileira, que, pelo que eu imagino, foi muito competente, porque não vi o original, mas eu vejo como os meus filhos falam, o de 19 anos e o de 15, esse tipo de linguagem muito direta e muito crua está muito bem relatado ali. E me dá a impressão que tem também uma clara influência da televisão, no que toca a uma coisa meio cinematográfica, mas com a velocidade da televisão. Não?
Yes, very much so. And the story, to understand the story, I have to tell you that it's not a direct impression of American culture. It's a story removed one generation back. It's American culture as it's presented to us through the television. Because I wanted it to be a book that really could have been written by anyone, anywhere in the world, simply by watching the TV. So it's a collection of all the scraps of spectacular media that we get every day coming through the screen. And they're spectacular because that's all that sells, and profit now is the superior motive in the world. And I wanted to cut together all those scraps which I own because I've consumed the hamburgers and I've bought all the products that brought the images to me. So I've kind of taped them all together into a collage, which is this book. And I wanted it to be obviously stereotypical of those images, but at the same time to tell its own story in a TV movie kind of way, in a cinematic way, so that it's, you know, it has improbable twists and turns, as well as very probable and very realistic ones, I think.
Mas você nunca viveu no Texas. Por que você escolheu o Texas para ambientar o livro?
Well, I loved Texas when I was a kid, and I spent plenty of time there. I was never resident. I actually even had family in Texas at one point. But I actually grew up in Mexico, and when I was a little bit older, when I was a teenager, I used to drive across the border and have adventures in Texas. And I was particularly interested in buying cars in America because we couldn't get the fancy cars in Mexico at that time. And I used to smuggle them across the border, and I ended up with many friends around there. And so originally it came because I was familiar and comfortable with the setting, and I had a good feeling for it. And secondly, because in the story of Vernon, I wanted every possible bad thing to happen to him that could happen in the modern world, and that has to include the death penalty. And for the death penalty, then it really has to be Texas.
Agora, Pierre, você disse que você não contava com toda a repercussão que a revista, o jornal The Guardian, acabou trazendo para o livro. Mas você não acha que justamente ao expor todos os seus dramas pessoais, dívidas, dependência de drogas, jogo, isso fatalmente despertaria a atenção do livro e atenção para você, já que vive-se, né, numa imprensa e numa mídia que, pelo menos os leitores, os espectadores, gostam desse tipo de segredo, de dificuldade, de exposição?
Yes, in a certain way. I just didn't expect the scale of it, because it's very different. I have to tell you, shifting from a private into a public person is a very curious experience, and you suffer a jet lag, and I still have it. I still don't fully realize why I should be here in the bull ring and you all be up there. And you sort of refuse to admit that you are that directly involved with the story. But the scale of it was extraordinary. When, for instance, I live currently in Ireland, and when that story broke, the Irish media had helicopters looking for my house in the mountains. There were packs of media. I live in a quite remote and beautiful part of Ireland.
Como Vernon, como o personagem dessa história.
Agora, por que você decidiu contar no momento que você ganhou o prêmio? Por que não contou antes?
I had no choice. I had no choice. If you want to hear that story, I'll try and tell it to you very briefly. Is that the story all broke around the occurrence of this man, Mr. Lenton, the American, whose apartment I had misappropriated and sold. And what actually happened is
Desculpe, só para esclarecer melhor para o nosso ouvinte, telespectador, um pouco do detalhe dessa história, porque quem não leu as entrevistas certamente não saberá do que aconteceu. O que você fez, em que época foi isso?
All right, and this was in the mid to late 1980s, at the very height of my drug craze and my debt problems. And I came, I had a neighbor in the place in Spain where I lived.
Granada.
In Granada, yep. And there came a moment where I took possession of the man's apartment. I made a deal with him. He didn't realize, in other words, I conned him in a certain way. He didn't realize that he was selling away the rights to his apartment. I then sold it on and used the money to try and fill in the holes of my debts and whatever. In intending and trying to repay him at some point, I was in touch with him for 2 or 3 years after that, but my problems grew worse. I was never able to repay him. We lost contact, and it remained probably my single greatest regret, because basically I'd stolen a house from the man, And he went back to America, and it was a desperate situation. Soon afterwards, I went into a hospital for therapy, and the whole situation collapsed. Now, jumping to September 2003, when I was announced as part of the Booker Prize shortlist of 6 people who were the finalists for the prize, I realized that just that announcement was going to cause bigger sales of the book. And I realized from those sales that I would have a chance over time to begin to pay Robert back. It was my biggest priority. And so I went to some trouble to find him, and I telephoned him in September. And I said, Robert, I'm going to be able to pay this back, hopefully, and I wanted to make sure that you're there and to make contact. And he was he was an incredible gentleman, and he said, it's no problem, I've put it all behind me, and you know, don't worry. And he was really, really very forgiving. But there was a member of his family who took great exception, who was still very, very angry. And the member of the family contacted the Booker Association in London and sent a mail that said, wait, this bastard, wait till I tell you what he was doing in the 1980s. And then after a couple of days, they contacted the newspapers in London because they went on the internet. I told Robert that I'd written a book, and so the family went on the internet and saw that I was shortlisted for the prize, and they were going, oh, don't give any prizes to this asshole. And so they actually wrote to the press, and in a way, although people in London think that somehow I conspired for the story to come out for publicity purposes, really I had no choice but to speak to somebody, because the press contacted me and said, look, there's an easy way or a hard way to do this. You know, either we're going to come to your door in the middle of the night, or you can talk to us. And so I didn't have anything to hide. It's not something that was unknown to my family or friends or even to my publishers. But it was a fact that obviously, you know, we didn't want to use it for publicity purposes.
Mas você acha que você chegaria a pagá-lo se você não ganhasse o Booker Prize?
Slowly.
Peter, eu queria falar um pouco do seu livro. A história principal do livro, em que o personagem central está envolvido, ela aparece ao longo do texto, de modo que um leitor qualquer dificilmente vai compreender do que se trata se ele não ler outras referências, às vezes na orelha do livro, ou seja, como for. Eu queria saber como é que surgiu a ideia, enfim, de contar essa história. Muitos autores dizem que isso é o mais difícil de qualquer livro, é saber que história se vai contar. Como é que ela surgiu para você?
It came by itself, spontaneously. It's very curious. I never had an idea in my head to write this book particularly. There was just a day, and I must have been frustrated and angry, and there was some sort of an explosive feeling that I had, and I wrote a page in the voice of Vernon, and he pretty much told the story then by himself. It's quite mysterious where it came from. Now, I had to work many long months to get it structured. I had to learn from scratch how to structure it and put a plot in there. But first of all, the subject matter seemed to be the only story in town. That was, for me, was an icon of the day that we live in, and an icon of the market economy and the people who follow it to the exclusion of everything else. And once I had the voice of Vernon, which came spontaneously, then the story sort of wrote itself in a way. I just had to follow it.
Pierre, o Luciano, enfim.
O livro foi todo escrito em primeira pessoa e, no caso, era um garoto de 15, 16 anos. De uma certa forma, isso te limitou muito na hora de jogar tudo que você queria e sintetizar isso tudo na cabeça de um garoto, um adolescente?
Yes, it was. It was limiting in the end. It was liberating in the beginning, and it was limiting in the end. But because I'm a beginner, I have no experience of how writing works over the length of a novel, for instance. So once I got to 100 pages, I was committed. and I was stuck with his voice. And in fact, I took as much liberty as I could in making him intelligent and furnishing his mind, perhaps a little bit more than your average Texan 15-year-old. But generally speaking, I was stuck with the limitations of what he would and wouldn't have known, you know. So it was fun. It was fun, but at the end of the day, it was quite limiting.
E ele também foi todo feito antes dos atentados nos Estados Unidos. Você acha que seria possível escrever esse livro depois de tudo que aconteceu lá?
Você assinou o contrato no dia do 11 de setembro, não é isso? Você assinou o contrato?
Yeah, I did. I think it was about 45 minutes before the tragedy. No, there's something very weird. And this is why I've become quite superstitious, because I'll tell you something quickly. It nearly killed me writing this novel, because I have absolutely no idea of discipline. I'm nocturnal, so I write day and night. I don't rest. After a few months of writing this, I was at the doctor every week with symptoms of every kind of anxiety and every kind of illness that I thought I had. And the doctor said, listen, it's your work. You have to find an office and leave the house and go to the office and then come back and leave the work there. So you can't do it 24 hours a day. Anyway, I had this incredible thing. And when I finally got to the point where I wrote the end, on the end of this book, I thought I would call my best friend in Mexico City and tell him the news. And I dialed his number, and it was engaged. I hadn't spoken to him for months, and the number was engaged. And I put the phone down, and it rang with my hand still on it. I picked it up, and it was my friend in Mexico City to tell me that the volcano that we lived under was erupting for the first time in 100 years. And then, as soon as I got a deal, I was jumping in the air because I had a publishing deal on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And within 45 minutes, this tragedy happened. And there is an energy locked behind the story of the thing as well, which by some coincidence, the book seems to be tied in with it. And there are many mysterious kismets and ironies flowing around it. So I have to thank my lucky stars. And to answer your first question, I wouldn't write this after 9/11. I don't think. It was finished long before 9/11. No, I'd write a much harsher book now. Less compassionate, probably.
Mas a ideia de fazer uma crítica aos Estados Unidos já existia desde o princípio, ou ela surgiu enquanto você escrevia?
It wasn't initially a criticism of the United States, but it was a criticism of the crap that the United States sells us through pictures. And I say, and that in a certain way isn't even their fault, because we buy the pictures and I consume as much as anyone. So, you know, I don't want to throw too many stones at it. But it was, initially, it was just a boredom with the endless, tedious rehearsal of promises that is American media. And with the absolute predictability of formats and just a frustration that my whole life should be affected. Like every day I see more American concepts and images than I do trees and birds. And it just got really boring. And it was that anger that made me criticize it. And initially it wasn't a cultural thing. And I don't think it still is even now. I did try and stay quite close to the idea that these were stereotypes from the media. These weren't direct Americans in an American culture.
Eu queria só perguntar uma coisinha para você em conexão com isso. É que você escreve um livro que fala de assassinato em série, do poder da mídia, da pena de morte, e você resolve filtrar tudo isso através da mente de um adolescente, né? Então a gente tem todo o choque da mente do adolescente. Eu concordo quando você diz que não é só uma crítica dos Estados Unidos, mas é uma crítica a toda a sociedade de mercado que a gente vive. E eu queria que você contasse um pouco para todo mundo, uma das cenas que mais me impressionou no seu livro, é que depois do assassinato em série na escola, né, a cidadezinha de Martírio começa a ter um progresso incrível, e a história da camiseta, que eles começam a vender camisetas com a historinha do martírio, né? Eu achei isso foi o momento da sátira mais feroz do seu livro, né? Foi o momento que a gente leva aquele choque e diz, meu Deus, é essa sociedade que nós vivemos. Eu queria que você comentasse um pouco como te veio a ideia da camiseta, que para mim é um resumo de todo o seu livro.
That's very interesting. Well, nobody else has singled out that particular thing. I particularly loved the idea of the T-shirt, and it probably arose, I don't actually know, but I would say it probably arose with the trial of O.J. Simpson. Because there were some fantastically bad taste souvenirs being sold, and that was such a long trial that manufacturers had plenty of time to get products ready for the market, and there was some really bad taste stuff. And there is, even now, there are websites of T-shirt manufacturers and stuff, and literally the day after any kind of a gruesome event or tragedy, there will be some really poor taste stuff they're selling. And there's a big market of people who buy them, you know. And I even buy them if they're funny enough. So then I think we suddenly hit the question of humor and its relation to the subconscious and our dealing with tragedy. And so I'm not sure that bad taste is necessarily useless in this case, but it's good that you hit on that.
Agora, você disse que talvez você tivesse escrito antes, aliás, se você escrevesse depois dos atentados, você escreveria com menos compaixão. Apesar de toda a sua crítica, de todo o cinismo, tem sim compaixão no seu livro. Porque o Vernon, ele enxerga que as pessoas são meio presas ali num vazio, numa bobagem qualquer. Mas ele dá uma situação muito privilegiada para uma personagem que é a mais desarrumada, a mais desarranjada de todas. É aquela garota que acaba depois ajudando ele a conseguir um dinheiro para fugir. E no final, ela aparece, no dia da execução, ela aparece toda bonita, chama a atenção, inclusive, dos guardas, e o Vernon fala, nossa, olha ela com todo o equipamento. Quer dizer, a gente pode entender que, no final, existe no seu livro redenção, a ideia de redenção para quem é legitimamente bom, porque ela era. E o Vernon também era, de uma certa forma.
I believe so. I wanted there to be, and I agree. I find it personally a compassionate and quite a hopeful book for the future. But it wasn't easy. I mean, the process of writing, I didn't have that idea when I started. And I have to say, in the first draft, the characters were more stereotypical, and they lacked any depth, and they grew. See, writing the novel, I also lived the mystery of writing and of art, and it is incredibly mysterious, because the intellect increasingly disengages from the job, and it becomes an emotional job, and I start becoming fond of characters, and they become fond of each other. There's a certain life that seems to erupt from the pages, which I was very respectful of, and that's where these compassions sort of came from, I think. I do find it a hopeful book, and I think they do redeem themselves. And it's just in the process of Vernon realizing that things are really shit, but that even so, you know, there's a kind of love there, you know? His mother still wants him to eat coleslaw because it's healthier, and you know, even though it's stupid and it's an insult, that is her best instinct, and in the end, I think he's quite forgiving, and he looks at the deeper impulses rather than the what can I say, the entanglements of vanity and greed that surround him.
Júlio.
Eu acho engraçado porque várias vezes as pessoas confundem o Vernon com vocês, confundem conscientemente. Mas tem alguma coisa que eu, às vezes, principalmente quando a gente pega o fato de ter muitas referências bíblicas, martírio, a cidade, Jesus, o personagem, a própria cena final que é um pastor que resolve, que aponta para a solução final do livro. Mas aí eu fico me perguntando, até nessa confusão entre Vernon e DBC, até que ponto você não estaria resolvendo ou que você não estaria se redimindo, você próprio não estaria se livrando de todas as suas culpas, inclusive da questão, eu acho que da questão paterna do seu pai. Eu acho que ele morre num momento de ruptura na sua vida, ali nesses 16 anos, que são também os 16 anos do Vernon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, shit, yeah, that was an incredible vehicle, and it provides incredible fuel for the work. I mean, you talk about the discipline of sitting down to write. When you have a psychology that you can weave into the story, not to say that it's my direct story, but the dynamic, there's a parallel dynamic, which is very much my story of guilt. Now, Vernon's innocent. I wasn't innocent, but still, I managed to build into that enough psychology to satisfy myself, and I did. I'm sure I resolved many things in the course of it.
Pierre, uma das coisas que salta aos olhos do seu livro, que chamou a atenção dos críticos no mundo inteiro, é que como você não vinha desse métier da literatura, você criou com uma linguagem muito fresca e você escreve de uma forma muito original. Embora lembre um pouquinho livros como O Apanhador no Campo de Centeio, do Salinger e coisas assim, parece que você criou uma linguagem realmente própria. Eu queria saber como que você criou frases como essas, eu queria citar uma frase bem rápida. Um filme que você já viu, com notas de piano elétrico tinindo ao fundo, suaves como ovários caindo em farinha de aveia. Eu queria saber de onde que você tira frases como essas e o que passa pela sua cabeça quando você está escrevendo uma coisa assim.
Don't ask me. God knows. God knows. Do you know, one of the reasons that I'm particularly useless and stupid in life, because you have to take into account, I missed, because of what Julia was saying, I mean, my father died, and although I came from a good family, I pretty much didn't get an education. I didn't go to university. I wasted all that time doing drugs and being an idiot. And on top of that, one of the reasons that I got into trouble, and one of the reasons that I remain pretty useless and unemployable in a job, is that I'm a dream, and I just get images of things. I'm quite visual, and I think quite musical. I love the sound of languages and words put together, and I get distracted by them. And so all of this stuff, even if I take a taxi from here to the airport, I will see something that will give me an idea that I'll write down. It's something that is not helpful in the life we are supposed to lead today, which is to get a job and shut up and go and make money and contribute to the economy. But it's probably very helpful for this type of thing. And I didn't know it. I really did feel like a completely useless idiot for a great many years. And I was even told so, actually, until I found a way to put some of those little pictures into the book.
Agora, Peter, há no seu livro alguns posicionamentos, algumas referências que lembram, em certa medida, o cineasta norte-americano Michael Moore. Você acha que você poderia ser comparado a um Michael Moore, talvez um Michael Moore não americano e das letras?
No, is the quick answer. It's tricky. I only, because I live in a remote corner of Ireland, we have a mobile cinema that comes to my local village every month. And usually it has the Terminator movies and Disney movies and stuff like that. It's in a truck, and it comes and unfolds. And one time, quite recently, it had Bowling for Columbine, so I didn't see that until the book was already published. But I don't, and for the reasons that I've already expounded, I think I did try to write this book as a foreigner. I do consider it a foreign novel, written from the television, rather than from the depth of American culture. So the comments that I make in there, I still like to feel are drawn from the remove of a television viewer and not from inside the place. Although I hope they're still valid. But no, anyway, I wouldn't like to be thought of as a foreign Michael Moore, I think.
Pierre, eu queria pegar carona na pergunta do Cassiano, quando ele leu aquele trecho do seu livro, e agora quando você me respondeu que você é uma pessoa fascinada pelo visual e pela música, me ocorreu te perguntar qual é a sua relação com a poesia, que na literatura é o que lida com o visual e com a música. Você gosta de poesia? Você curte poesia? Porque esses pedaços do seu livro, tem muitos pedaços que se lê como pequenos poemas, né? Eu não sei se era isso que o Cassiano tinha em mente, mas foi isso que me pareceu. Quando eu li o seu livro, havia momentos de redenção poética ali, que você tentava sair daquele horror, que o Vernon tentava sair daquele horror, através da poesia. Não sei, você tem alguma relação com poesia? Você gosta de poesia? Como é que é?
I do. Having said that, I probably haven't read as much as one of your students reads in a week.
I doubt that.
But there are things, no, there are certain things from poetry that stick in my mind
Like
forever.
what?
My favorite line ever is from a Caribbean poem that says, and it speaks of, for me, it speaks of life, and especially of the difficulty of writing. And it says, I love it as drowned sailors love the sea. That's pretty much how I feel about a lot of things. But no, poetry, because it was something we were forced to do at school, I often found it quite boring. And that stayed with me. And it's only now that I'm growing up and I'm trying to, I'll try and rediscover it. But I don't read a lot at the moment. I would like to read more.
Peter, o seu livro fala dessa cultura americana, da violência, enfim, de um massacre numa pequena cidade do Texas. E, curiosamente, eu acho até engraçado a gente estar falando isso, e acho que é bom porque leva os leitores a comprar livro, e é isso que é importante, porque no Brasil se lê muito pouco, e quanto mais as pessoas lerem, melhor será. Mas, enfim, o que me chamou a atenção é que há um personagem do seu livro que é muito pouco descrito, com poucas palavras, que aparece muito rapidamente no final, que é um pastor dentro de uma cadeia, no corredor da morte, e esse pastor dá o giro na história, é a partir daí que a história muda. Então eu pergunto se tem nisso algum tipo de convicção sua de que o caminho para se sair dessa sociedade totalmente materialista é algum caminho espiritual.
In a certain way it is, yeah. But it also refers to the spirit of intelligence. So that it's interesting that you point that out. In fact, the message comes across as quite a spiritual one. But what the character Vernon really needs to learn is to get smart with the tools that he has at his disposal. And that is to learn to manipulate others into doing what he wants, by finding their weaknesses.
De um certo sentido, o seu Deus que aparece no título. Um pequeno Deus.
Exactly right. And until he can learn to take unto himself the self-regard and the arrogance of a god, and to manipulate and to find the weaknesses of others and exploit them the way his have been found and exploited, then he will die in that culture. And that's the message. And it comes to him in spiritual form, but really it deals with the mechanics of intelligence. Don't sit around saying you're innocent. You have to get up and do something dramatic.
E isso apareceu ao longo na fase que você, digamos, estava comandado pela emoção, ou isso desde o início você tinha essa ideia da história e esse final surpreendente já desenhado?
No, no. The story of the book traveled quite a lot. It changed quite a bit in its course. And between the first draft, which I wrote very quickly in 5 weeks, and the last draft, which happened 18 months later, after much agony, quite a few things changed. And that was really, when I wrote that particular sequence, I was mindful of having to also give the story the air of an American tale, as it might be told on American TV. And You know, many things contributed to it, but it wasn't there in the beginning, certainly not. In fact, without giving any of the story away, I'll tell you that the ending of the first draft was almost the opposite of what it is in the last draft. Mm-hmm. So it just wasn't right. I had to go back and rewrite it.
Pierre, você disse que o seu livro, de certa forma, era a jovem América encarando as promessas que fizera a si mesmo. A jovem América encarando as promessas a si mesmo. Você acha realmente que a jovem América é tão espirituosa como no seu livro, não?
Not spiritualism. I have to say it's a very subjective thing that you've hit on there, and it comes from my own feeling about America, because I grew up very much in the shadow of America. My father was employed out of New York, although we lived in Mexico. So I had a lot of contact with Americans and with America when I was very young, and I loved it. I loved it as you love the best lover you ever had. I thought it was fantastic. And I was living across the border, so it was even more bright. Before the free trade agreement, before NAFTA, Mexico didn't have access to any of those products and whatever. And America was like a toy shop for me. And I used to sit and really, I loved the idea of positive thinking. I loved the idea of self-empowerment, and that you should actually work on making yourself feel powerful and deserving of good fortune and able to go out and conquer the world and do whatever you wanted. All that kind of bullshit really impressed me when I was a kid, because I wasn't a completely confident and secure person either, and so the whole package was fantastic. And yet still, even as all those theories and products were happening, they were happening, it seemed to me, with a kind of an innocence. They were happening with a certain softness. In other words, they weren't the very end or beginning of the world. They were just ideas. You could also buy pet rocks and all sorts of other wacky things. They weren't such cynical tools of such a desperately competitive market. They were just ideas, and things were much more friendly. And so I saw that in my lifetime anyway as a kind of more, it seemed to me more innocent. And I know it wasn't as a global power, but as a culture within itself, it seemed to me to be much more innocent and much more open to look at itself in a certain way.
Peter, o seu livro se passa no Texas. E hoje em dia uma associação quase que imediata, pelo menos para muita gente, entre esse estado é com a dinastia Bush. O presidente George W. Bush e a sua onda conservadora, a direita fundamentalista cristã cada vez mais forte nos Estados Unidos. O que representa George W. Bush para você?
I'm glad you asked that. I'll tell you exactly what he represents. I see, and this was something behind the imagery of the whole of the work that Vernon is, because I saw the high school massacre as a very tragic icon of not only American culture, but where the consumer culture is headed. Because I see these, it seemed to me these were the children being the more vulnerable ones, in a climate where you have to succeed or die. And if you're not the most intelligent, and if you're not the most good-looking, and you're not the most academic, where are you going to go? These seemed to me children who'd fallen through the gap of an overheated culture, and they popped. And for me, Bush and that dynasty represents, if you take the metaphor that all the world is a schoolroom, and that every country is a pupil in the school, and you have your shy ones, and you have your aggressive ones, you have your fit ones, and you have your rich ones, and there's one fat 13-year-old with a gun. And that, for me, is the whole dynasty, and that's what he represents.
Peter, você escreveu seu livro antes do 11 de setembro, mas depois dele, muitos autores se viraram para o mundo como está e tentaram fazer uma crítica tanto aos Estados Unidos quanto à situação mundial causada por eles. tá aí o livro do Ian McEwan, Saturday, dá para mencionar outros autores, Carlos Fuentes, Saramago. Adianta tudo isso? Que diferença faz a literatura para essa discussão?
No, literature has to be the first participant. I think that art drives culture more than science or politics, because it plants ideas. And you know, before anything gets invented or implemented, we dream about it. We have to imagine it's possible. A format is created. But it's true what you say. I wrote the thing before 9/11. It was finished before 9/11, and it's not my fault that the paradigm shifted. It's just another irony that in a book about shifting paradigms, the things should shift so dramatically. But when I finished the book, this still would have been just another piece of American trivia. It's like Simpsons with a little more edge to it, maybe. And suddenly the world shifted around the work, and it's received, I think, much more attention than it would have in the absence of those events. And I'm sorry for that, but you know, it's out of my hands.
Mas você acha que os livros têm poder de mudar alguma coisa?
Hello?
Perdemos.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
He hasn't got any sound from
De
it.
novo. Ok, mas toca dessa pergunta em diante, Munga.
I could probably understand.
Ok.
You say it again, say it slowly.
Não, deixa assim mesmo, tudo bem. Porque senão vai dar uma falta de continuidade. Temos? It's okay?
Oh, you okay? Yeah, good. Sorry.
Faça a pergunta novamente, por favor.
Não, eu perguntava se você acha que a literatura pode mudar alguma coisa.
Um pouquinho, só um pouquinho. Você vai começar. Vou dar um sinal, você vai. Vai.
Então, eu queria saber se você acha que a literatura tem força para mudar alguma coisa no mundo hoje.
No, well, nothing has enough power except the instruments where the power is vested, I think. But still, you have to do it. I have a romance with the idea that it could be possible. It's a good reason to try and write better all the time. Is that I have a lovely idea that it could be possible to change minds with a work. But having said that, I'm not setting out with any kind of political agenda, and I'll end up writing books about butterflies and teddy bears and stuff like that. So I'm not, again, because the paradigm shifted, it makes me look like, suddenly I'm a hardcore critic, and I'm not as hardcore as you would think, actually. I eat hamburgers too. And they make a very good sandwich in America.
Júlio?
Isso, quando você fala, até o que ela falou, me remete a uma fala do Agualusa, que é um escritor angolano muito lido no Brasil, que ele diz que o povo inglês está perdendo a sua língua, porque como ela é uma língua universal, como ela pertence a todo mundo, ela não pertence a ninguém. Você, quando escreve do ponto de vista de um estrangeiro, e acho que tem uma fala sua em alguma das entrevistas, em que você fala que para ter acesso à cultura americana, qualquer pessoa pode apenas ligar a televisão, que entra em contato e, de alguma forma, se apropria dessa cultura americana. Não estaria ocorrendo com essa cultura americana o mesmo que está ocorrendo com a língua? Ou seja, é uma cultura minha também. Eu posso ligar a televisão e ser influenciado pelo que está passando nos Simpsons, do mesmo modo como um garoto texano. Ou seja, mas aquele garoto texano, ele também não está perdendo essa cultura americana?
Well, I don't know that he's losing. First of all, what is American culture? It's very tricky, and this is where it's another reason I tried to stay close to television stereotypes with this book, because you have to be careful. I mean, America also has a fantastic African-descended population that's given us jazz, and some amazing cultures within the culture. So consumerism and the culture of succeed or die, and the culture that says that there is no higher value than the dollar is what I was addressing particularly. And that won't disappear because it's a culture of profit at any cost. And that's what I get whenever I switch the TV on. And that's the reason that everything I see is predictable. And that's the reason it will become more sensational and more tragic, and you know, until something happens, until it burns itself out. So, and it's true that it's now increasingly your culture as well, and everyone's culture, whether they like it or not, really, because it surrounds you. Even if you switch the TV off, there will be something around you. There will be ideas, and the people around you will be infected in a way with the hamster wheel of vanity and greed that drives the engine of consumption.
Pierre, você não acha que a palavra, até a expressão cultura americana, começa a se tornar hoje um símbolo vazio? Vazio no sentido que pode caber qualquer coisa dentro dele? Que o que a gente está falando, na verdade, é uma cultura de mercado, que, embora tenha até surgido e se arrefecido nos Estados Unidos, mas ela é global. É uma imitação de padrão e de desejo de sucesso que está no mundo inteiro. Então, quando a gente fala em cultura americana, você não acha que a gente está desprezando outras coisas, incluindo só esse aspecto da cultura de mercado numa palavra que é muito mais abrangente do que a gente imagina?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, yeah. We should say market culture. Yeah, and that's exactly what I mean. It's a very old expression in America that says the business of America is business. The Constitution is actually isn't as complicated as you would think. For all of its various amendments and supposed rights, the American Constitution is very much a business document and a mission statement from a few very wealthy people a couple centuries ago, and it remains pretty much that. So yeah, it's true, and this is why you know, I want to be careful to not disregard those parts that are actually culture. So.
Até porque muita parte da crítica contra essa cultura de mercado vem também dos Estados Unidos. Embora, claro, de uma forma menos conhecida, mas ela existe lá. Não é que é todo mundo feliz e satisfeito com, e sem o menor senso crítico.
Yeah, of course it does, but the United States is the driver.
Aí sim.
And there was one solitary man who was mostly responsible for that consumer culture. As a man who was a nephew of Sigmund Freud, who decided he would be the first one to exploit Freud's ideas that we humans were infected with subconscious and dangerous forces, which he thought he could manipulate for profit, and he did. And even Wall Street ended up saying we must change this culture from a needs to a desires culture. And so there is truly a traceable philosophy springing from a very small group of people that have led that market culture to come, and they're still ahead of us. I know what you're saying, that now it is a global thing, but you know, if you want to see where it's at today, America is where it's happening. They're selling fractions of fractions of fractions of fractions of fractions of future potential fractions of promises.
Pierre, você chegou a mencionar que se fosse escrever uma continuação para o Vernon God Little, que você chegou a pensar em escrever uma continuação e que provavelmente você colocaria ele como até chegar presidente da República. Você acha que ele seria realmente um bom presidente, o Vernon God Little? Seria melhor que o George Bush? Né?
Well, he would have to if I wrote him, wouldn't he? I mean, I don't know. I haven't written that one. It's true, not many people know that, but this was originally going to be a trilogy. And I drafted 3 works, of which this was the only one I finished. And I wanted to do, this was the very black, urban liberal position on the market culture. And then I was going to write an opposite, where in fact the protagonist was the villain, and the culture, the conservative culture, was actually very healthy and supportive and positive. So I wanted to make a balance, and then write a third one that tried to find the grey area and to balance it up. And that's where Vernon would maybe have become president. But of course, I took this one to the publisher and told him that I had another couple planned, and he said, "Don't push your luck. Leave it." So I left it.
Você falou em Freud aí, e um dos personagens também muito patéticos do livro é a mãe do Vernon. Uma mãe cujo o grande barato dela é uma geladeira bege de 2 portas e é uma viúva americana absolutamente patética na sua relação com os filhos. Isso tem alguma coisa a ver com a sua história real?
No. No, it has nothing whatsoever to do with my personal story. The mother, I have to say, in the very early draft of this book, again, because I'm a beginner, I feel I may have over-egged the pudding, as we say, a little bit, because I had religious metaphors running through this. I also had a central metaphor, which was adolescence as well. Vernon was, everything bad was happening to him, because that's how we feel things happen to us. When you're an adolescent, things are either fantastic or they're terrible. And I wanted a sense of that, you know. It's like, oh no, I'm going to be put to death now because of you. And the mother originally was going to be symbolic of the state. Yeah, I wanted her to be symbolic of the state, who wasn't looking after, in fact, its people. It was completely self-concerned, and it was neglecting the one thing that was intelligent and that was worth looking out for, which is the population. And so that started her becoming so vain and greedy, and then she became pathetic by herself. And I also tried to give her a little bit of what we all recognize in our mothers when we're growing up. You know, those days when your mother is your worst enemy? I wanted her to have a little bit of that. It's just, she's telling you all the wrong things and rubbing you up the wrong way. So she's a real amalgam, and she changed a lot. Her name changed about probably 12 times while I wrote this, and her character shifted and shifted and shifted throughout. And she finally defined herself.
Eu li em várias entrevistas suas referências de entrevistadores a influências que você teve, até a história de que você começou a escrever quando tinha 9 anos, por determinação de uma companhia aérea que queria o diário de bordo dos seus passageiros, e você era um passageiro frequente. Mas, de alguma forma, a sensação que me deu o seu livro é que tem muito pouca influência. Muito embora, certamente você não conhece, mas ele me chama... Aparece uma semelhança com um livro que circulou no Brasil há muito tempo, que não tem nada a ver a história, mas eu digo no relato da primeira pessoa, que é um livro de um escritor brasileiro, Marcelo Rubens Paiva, que escreveu quando era muito jovem. Ou seja, então o que mais me surpreende nesse seu trabalho é como é que você conseguiu registrar essa linguagem jovem, sem levar em conta o fato de que você tinha 40 anos quando escreveu o livro, e não 15 ou 16. Como é que você conseguiu isso?
Because I'm retarded. Because I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, I haven't grown up myself. I'm still very young-headed, I think. There's probably some truth to that. And I'm interested, you know, things get boring. It surprised me when I grew up that people continue to evolve. It was fantastic when I suddenly met 60 and 70-year-old people who were continuing to have the dramas of teenagers in their life, and that was a surprise to me, because I expected you hit 20 and then you died, and so part of that I think is just, it's much more fun. I have more of an ear for young people thinking and speaking, and I think that's where our future, where our hope lies as well. But just on the streets, all the funniest things happen from youngsters. So I have an ear for it, and I probably am slightly emotionally retarded myself, I should say.
Mas você realmente começou a escrever por causa dessa história da companhia aérea? De que quando você viajava e tinha que fazer uma espécie de diário de bordo? Pelo menos eu li isso numa entrevista, não sei se procede. Não? Nada a ver.
I haven't heard that one. No, I haven't heard the airline story. It may be, it's either horribly misquoted or it's not true.
Pierre, quer saber se para você um grande livro, a grande arte, necessariamente ela precisa nascer da culpa, da dor, do desconforto?
No, not always. No, but no. All I probably learned is that those are very helpful fuels. If they fester. I mean, I had a situation where I festered with these various emotions for a long time, and it is very useful fuel, and not just for the psychology behind the plot of a book, but in also giving you pressure and discipline to sit down. You come to a moment in your life where you say, well, now I have to do something, you know, or why am I even here? Just a certain moment. And having those sort of pressures is great fuel for that. And it's probably, I don't know enough about, we have to speak to Maria Luisa, who is an expert and more well-read literarily, but I would say it must be helpful for the art if artists have a chaotic life and have, you know.
Esse negócio da dor, eu fiquei muito mal resolvido com essa sua história de droga. A primeira coisa eu queria entender o seu fundo do poço. Qual foi aquele momento a partir do qual você disse assim, eu não posso mais me drogar? E que grande dor é essa? E tem uma outra coisa que eu também não entendo, que na verdade é esse dirt but clean, que é sujo mas limpo. Porque a droga, ela é a compulsão. Ela é, se eu começo a beber é mais um, é só mais um, é só mais um, e esse mais um nunca acaba. E aí eu vejo que você gosta de caipirinhas.
Yeah, too much.
Como é que você concilia esse barato da caipirinha com a sobriedade?
There are different types of sobriety. You know, it's an interesting question, and I don't know if I can speak universally. In my case, I hit the wall seriously in about 1990 or 1991. And that was the end of a road that I started in about 1978 or 79 or even earlier maybe, I don't know. So basically, I went to a party one night in the 1970s, and I ended up in 1990 sort of with nothing left and having destroyed relationships and all sorts of stuff. And it's impossible to describe that. I mean, it's a very great emptiness. And the problem with it is, too, that you're still, at the moment of collapse, you're still very close to a feeling of intoxication. It's hard to... The pain of it is the type of grief you get when you're bereaved with a close family member, because it's something that you have to digest over years and years and years. So it's a lingering pain, and you're aware that you have all the time in the world, that nothing can happen to you more because you've lost everything, and you're there just with your pain to wake up and all of that. Now, caipirinhas, well, that's a fantastic thing, and you see, there's good drugs and bad drugs now as well. And I can drink plenty and not be alcoholic. I'm a pretty heavy tobacco smoker. I've managed to focus all of my addictive tendency into the cigarette, and then hopefully one day I can be done with the cigarette without starting some other terrible compulsive thing, masturbating or something in public. And you know, if you're trying to get to the dirty but clean thing, I think it's more it's not so much clean from substances, but just clean person. I think you can lend me 10 reais today and I will pay you back very quickly.
Você conta que...
I'll be a better friend than I ever was, you know?
Peter, você conta que quando você ganhou o prêmio mudou sua vida do dia para a noite. E até outro dia, escritores tinham uma vida solitária, não tinham que fazer verdadeiros roadshows para promover seus livros. Como é que você vê essa pressão do mercado hoje para você vir até uma Bienal do Livro no Rio, dar entrevista para vários cadernos culturais? Como é que é isso para você? Como é que você conseguia isso com ser escritor?
It's taken a while, and to be honest, it's part of your question as well. One of the things I discovered when I finally had my personal collapse at what I will call the end of my youth, one of the lessons that came out of it was that my instincts were wrong. And we're taught to trust our instincts and whatever, but you know, if you're intoxicated, your instincts are wrong. And one of the things that I was taught, and which has been very useful, is not to act when I absolutely, unless I absolutely have to, not to act, to observe, and to go along and see what happens, and not to be making sudden movements and sudden actions in this way or that, but to observe things and to be patient. And it's very recent still. I mean, my book a year ended less than a year ago, and so I've been observing. It's been a very quick lesson in how the publishing market works, and it's been a very, very hectic time. So to answer your question, you can't do both things. I have to stay home now and write. It was impossible because they literally sent helicopters to my house, so I had to face up to a certain amount of publicity immediately following that prize, and I've done my best to observe and to pay respect out of gratitude for the good fortune of it. And I've been to a few places, and now, except for Brazil, which is a special case, I have pretty much stopped doing that, and now I just want to stay home and write. And so it was like a nice punctuation in my life, and it was a comma, if you like, between one section and another.
Pierre.
E se você está escrevendo livro novo, é isso? Você está escrevendo
Yes,
ou você
I am.
está escrevendo a adaptação para o cinema do Vernon God Little?
No, I'm finishing a second novel. Oh, I couldn't get involved with the screenplay for Vernon. That would take forever. Because they have a history, you know, even after you write it, they could change it for the next 10 years, and I couldn't get involved with that. I'm finishing a second novel at the moment.
E esse segundo livro, se eu li certo, porque depois da informação que você me deu na pergunta anterior, eu fico em dúvida. Fala de um americano envolvido com uma russa que conheceu na internet e que discute um pouco o papel dos dólares no mundo e da globalização. É isso ou é tudo errado?
No, it's an Englishman. It's quite tricky, and to even explain you the basic plot, I will be giving a surprise away. But I can say that it deals with a very soft, middle-class, adult European who does, and the metaphor is more globalization in this case. But it's the story of a man who gets a Russian bride on the internet because he's too dumb and lazy to get laid in his own country, because he thinks that the rest of the world is just waiting, is just begging for him to come with $1 and to buy a Brasil t-shirt and all the latest accessories. And so he figures the world is going to fall at his feet. And it's the story of him discovering that this woman is much more intelligent and much harder and faster than he is.
As mulheres vão adorar.
Hey?
As mulheres vão adorar.
Absolutely, and it's the truth. So it's just it's a little bit metaphorical of our Anglo view of how we're via instruments like the World Bank and IMF, we're going to fix up the rest of the world and we're going to do all of this. I mean, bullshit. You know, the rest of the world is a much smarter place than we give it credit for. And it's just sitting there waiting for us to come.
Pierre, você falou uma vez para mim, quando a gente fez a entrevista, você disse que tinha um plano também de escrever um livro que passava pelo Brasil. Eu queria saber, você já mencionou aqui Caipirinha, e aqui no intervalo você falou também Kelly Key, que você já conheceu Kelly Key, a cantora, e eu sei que você foi ontem no baile funk também. Eu queria saber se essas coisas todas entrariam nesse seu romance, se você realmente pretende escrever um romance que passe pelo Brasil, ou se era uma brincadeira isso.
Oh, these are my very, very first days in Brazil. I've always wanted to come, and it's for many reasons. But these are literally my first days here, and I've been lucky enough through especially Ana Lima, who is just behind you, and some people at my publishers have made sure that I didn't have to see anything touristic, but got to see some real happenings in Brazil. It's been fantastic. And I did. It's interesting, we're talking about Vernon was a book that happened spontaneously, and I'd never thought about it. What I have thought about and would like to do always was a book that had a setting here. Because you never, unless it's a James Bond movie or something, I find it hasn't been used in the way I would love to use it. And obviously I couldn't ever write a Brazilian novel, but I could bring a foreigner here in a novel and do some kind of setting. And it would be a fantastic and very arsey excuse to come and spend a few months and sit around observing and seeing how it works. So there's a lot of self-interest in there as well. I think it's a sacrifice.
Agora, Peter, o próximo livro sobre o qual você está se debruçando, você mencionou a história da noiva russa e o cidadão europeu que quer trazê-la a conhece via internet, quer trazê-la por conta dos dólares. Essa história é baseada numa experiência real sua?
I have to admit, I was a bride on the internet. No, it's I've tried to make this very different from Vernon. I was very aware that there could be a possibility of me rewriting Vernon as a second novel. And somebody told me there's a danger of that. When you're a new novelist, you do something, you invest bits of your life into the book, and then when you write a second novel, even subconsciously, the dynamic somehow, you rewrite the same thing again. And I was really conscious of that. So I've tried to write something very different. And this one's in third person. It has adult characters, and it's about something that I haven't directly experienced, any of that Russian bride stuff. So I've had to go and do research in places, and I've had correspondence. But this, in other words, I found the easiest part of Vernon for me was the voice and the character, and that's what a lot of people in England said they liked about the book, and it made me feel slightly as if I'd gotten away with something, because I'd found it easy to write the voice, and I wanted to give myself the exercise of writing what I would call a proper book in the third person, to really tackle the work of a subject which I decide, and then the discipline of putting it all together, and etc. So.
Agora, você falou que fez pesquisas sobre as noivas na internet, em particular sobre as russas, é isso? Até onde você chegou nessa pesquisa?
I went to the Caucasus quite recently as well. So I have been there in the even in what is still a war zone around the Caucasus. I went with a charity, Médecins Sans Frontières, who have medical units and psychological support for locals around there. It was amazing. So it's you know, I didn't have sex with any of them, so it hasn't gone that far. But to understand the dynamic, just enough to write in the details of the culture, if you know what I mean, and to see how the whole thing works. That's a big industry. Russian brides on the internet is pretty big. And a lot of it is a scam, and a lot of it's false, and then a lot of it's real. And I'm just trying to figure out that for the detail of the book.
Tem muito de ficção, né?
Hey?
Tem muito de ficção na internet, obviamente.
Yes, there is.
Para finalizar, a última pergunta. Eu imagino que alguém que escreve o primeiro livro, consegue publicar, ganha o maior prêmio de literatura da Inglaterra, torna-se um sucesso da noite para o dia, deve tremer nas bases quando vai escrever o segundo livro, deve ficar preocupado de saber se vai funcionar. Você está confiante?
I'm not thinking about it. I'm not thinking about it. Obviously, there are expectations. I think it's very important for me to completely ignore them and to stay at home and just do the best that I can. And also, I'm looking at the longer road, because I want to be talking to you after 7 and 8 and 10 and 15 books, hopefully. So I just have to learn and do what I can do and sod it, you know. I've been lucky these last couple of years as well, and I won't be lucky every day.
Claro. Muito obrigado, Peter, pela sua entrevista. Obrigado a nossos entrevistadores e a você que está em casa. E na próxima segunda estaremos aqui com mais um Roda Viva. Uma ótima semana e até segunda.